Welcome, Thomas. So glad you could join us for this Harvard Gazette interview. And I'm Lori Shadari. I'm Director of Communications for Harvard Catalyst at the medical school. And it's great to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you, Laurie. I'm happy to be here.
So, we introduced you to the Harvard community a couple of years ago. And since then, you've been teaching workshops and offering talks, which have been wonderful during this time that most of us would agree is a time of collective trauma. And I wonder what your thoughts are on how we should be thinking about the current collective traumas that we're facing. Everything from the pandemic to polarization, political unrest, climate crisis, and just to name a few.
Yeah, I think first I love to talk about collective trauma as something like a traumatic event that a bigger part of a population, a nation, or maybe the world right now is going through collectively. And it results in individual traumatizations or difficulties, but it also there is a shared cultural space. I believe that we need to take in account. So often trauma is being seen as something that happens to a person or as a personal issue, and now we are talking about the collective or systemic dimension, just to define what we are talking about. And in that sense, I think we see always two phenomena appear at the same time. So there's a very stressful current situation, COVID, and then but that or the coming climate crisis. I mean, it's already here, but it's kind of intensifying, and so the stress, the systemic stress, is rising, and hurricane impacts, wildfire impacts, like many impacts on a wider scale, actually intensify that systemic stress and the systemic traumatization. Now, so there's something that's happening right now, but I think it's very important to include that it's happening and it meets in all of us and our shared history, the unintegrated part of our shared past. And that shared past is, in a way, like the sand in the engine, how we respond to the current crisis. So even the fact that it becomes a current crisis shows already that it's hard for us, or for some of us, to digest the necessities and change processes and challenges that come with a systemic change like COVID and respond to it creatively. So if you say resilience or systems resilience is the capacity to stay related to a current overwhelming situation. But if I feel reactive, hyperactivated, or dissociated and numb, and I meet the current crisis, then the current crisis will stress me so much that the crisis is actually in my past, not necessarily today, because given my intelligence and my capacities, maybe we would be able to deal with that global crisis in a different way. But it meets already the limitation that is a result of a prior traumatization. And a prior traumatization might be in my own biography, but it might also be in my ancestral biography, and it might have been in our shared culture, like a civil war in the US, or a Second World War in the world, or a Holocaust, or slavery and racism. And so I believe when we talk about collective trauma, we are usually talking about the root causes that often lead up to the current crisis and the way how we are able to respond to a current crisis. And they are kind of entangled. That's why I love to in a simplified way, we could say systems change depends on three factors: the evolutionary drive, or the drive of expression and creativity and becoming; habits, which usually create structures, internal structures, external structures, but those habits are evolutionarily informed. They are informed by the current necessities that the world needs. But then if we need to change structures, fluid structures are adaptable. So we deconstruct them and we construct new structures. So in order to change habits, we need activation energy. Sometimes we need activism. Sometimes we need more education or public education, information campaigns, and so on. But the third factor is the collective frozenness that we cannot activate through push. And that's, I think, where many movements actually get stuck, because we can we can through activation energy push habits to develop, open up and get reconstructed, but we cannot push trauma. If we push trauma, we get resistance, we get frozenness, we get againstness, we get polarization. And I think that's why when we are in need of a systemic change, like through COVID the world changed, through the climate crisis the world's going to change dramatically. We need the capacity to change urgently, and it's kind of limited and reduced by the amount of frozenness. The trauma is per definition is freezing life and dissociating life, which is very helpful to survive better, but it has sometimes severe after effects. Yeah.
So you mentioned both COVID and unrest, which of course in the US is about polarization right now, the election, racial inequality. What would you say about all of these sort of interconnected and at this point timely traumas working together? What is the effect on people in different ways, the different layers that are being revealed?
Yeah. When we look at trauma, comes with two major sets of symptoms. The one is a hyperreactivity and a tremendous amount of stress and reactivity. The other one is a numbness, an indifference, and a kind of a disconnect. So trauma comes with the underlying sense that we have when we carry trauma, that we are separate, at least at times. We are separate in when we go through relationship arguments or crisis, we might feel separate. We might feel separate in conflict. We might feel separate in the political arena. So there's us and them, and there is kind of a separation. It's not anymore like a conversation and a mutual development. Usually it ends up in a fight. And that fight has an invisible canyon that is in between us and them. And so these two major sets of symptoms, in a way, reduce our capacity to relate. But since relation or interdependence and interconnectedness are the basis of a data flow, of information to be exchanged, of being able to, that I can put myself in your shoes, as William Ury says it, and you can put yourselves in my shoes, and we can have like that inspires us to find solutions together. That's often not happening. And the more stress, like if you have one or two or three new adversities or stress factors in the system, then that's just gonna get intensified. So the more multiple layers of new stress we have that meet the undigested past in us, so the more we will express those symptoms. Either we will be more and more absent, or we will be more and more stressed out and reactive and hyperactivated and expressing a lot of those symptoms. And and I think the only chance that we have is to see one thing: integrated history is present. Unintegrated history is the past. The past are emotions, thoughts, body sensations that overshadow my current experience. So I need to take a business decision, but suddenly a lot of fear and stress comes up. Usually that stress is a developmental stress and it's not connected to my business decision. But for me, in my subjective experience, I very much project that onto my current business state. If I don't learn to discern those and integrate the fear so that I can make a more connected business decision that is rationally informed and also internally connected, then I will simply stay in that mix, and I will my former fears will influence my decision making today as a grown up human being. And so when we say that the capacity, so presence is integrated history, the past is unintegrated history. So how can we create together environments that help us to presence more and relate deeper and more meaningfully in order to support our mutual past to get integrated? Now, it's a bit counterintuitive because it seems like the climate crisis is coming and we don't have time, which scientifically also shows that there is a real urgency, but subjectively, in my experience, my prior traumatization adds more stress to the urgency. And here we need to actually slow down for a moment, come together, supported integration to harvest the post traumatic growth and learning effect in order to deal with the current crisis. And that's sometimes counterintuitive because we want to run, but and activism say, no, we don't have time. But we have to take the time because otherwise the unconscious trauma will become the jeopardizing effect in the movement to take care of the issue. And we see this in traumatized clients, but we also see this in the systemic symptoms. And then it sounds like, oh, as humanity, we are just too stupid or too lazy to deal with climate change. And that's not the point. That's missing severely the societal symptom. And we are not looking at where does that symptom come from, because we are able to deal with climate change as humanity. But I think there is an unrecognized factor that we are not factoring in enough. And that's why we bump against it. It becomes an obstacle and not a part of our process. Everything that's unconscious becomes an obstacle and not a conscious part of the process. And if I know that that's my way, I will deal with it. But if I don't, if it looks like rocks that block my way, then I say, oh my, the path is blocked. And I think we are seeing that right now, and all the social symptoms like polarization, massive othering, massive societal fractures showing up. The fragmentation in the system will just be more and more visible, because that's actually the truth. So what we see is also the truth. And it's hard to see the truth because we want to see a good world, but we don't. And I think we will have to align with the fact that what happens in our society, even the fake news, is part of the truth that we are facing, that it's so easy to spread disinformation, and that disinformation is only being there where we are not. Like it only happens in the parts where we are individually and collectively absent. And the more we own those absent places where we are not anymore connected, where we don't feel ourselves, where we don't feel others, where we don't feel society, then we will have to deal with the symptoms.
One of the ways you speak about trauma is you weave the individual with the collective, which I find is very valuable for people. And most of us are not used to thinking like that. We think from a therapeutic or psychological perspective about ourselves as individuals. And then we leave the collective to sociology. And when I met you in 2017, you came to the MIT Innovation Center in Boston, and you said the Holocaust sits in the room with us right now. And that really struck me as an important and very honest observation. And I couldn't really say I heard that before or could really understand exactly how it sat, but I felt the truth in that. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about
Yeah.
what that is. And
I think when we see that I often say trauma is taking a loan from our own future. It means when in trauma situations, I'm so stressed, I'm so overwhelmed that in a way, in order to shut down a part of myself, to numb a part of myself, and to be so stressed out in order to survive better, for example, because usually in very traumatizing situations, that's what seems to be the most urgent to survive. So the trauma response is a very intelligent function within us, within our nervous systems and bodies and so on. But there is a price we pay. We need to pay back the debt, and we need to pay back the interest. And I believe I call this trauma fuel that once I have that unconscious stress that moment on, I carry a heightened amount of baseline stress in my system. And that baseline stress eats more, like uses more fuel, my life energy and my even my body's capacity. So I'm burning more fuel that is not sustainable. And I don't even know often that that's what's happening, because just in the last decades, more and more the notion of trauma and like I think it's coming more and more as a kind of a public knowledge what actually trauma is and how it works and how it affects us. But the attachment stress that hasn't been integrated in children, that have been neglected or abused, that adversity is still living deep in our bodies as grown up people. We just don't know because it became so normal. So I say, that's me. Yeah, but that's not me. That's me in a hurt place. It's very important to name. And when when I and the same is true. I mean, that's the individual part. And the same is true that millions of people in concentration camps needed to dissociate so much of, I mean, some of the atrocities that I heard and that some people survived are heartbreaking and unbelievable. And and you can survive, or for most of the people maybe, can survive those situations only heavily dissociated and traumatized, which is very natural. I think that's what it is. And but the all that suppressed and fragmented information doesn't disappear. And I think we are seeing more and more the transgenerational transmission of trauma and the effects that it doesn't disappear with that generation. And that's that was also my finding in doing all this group work for 18 years, and seeing over and over again, whenever we touch the collective denial and we met the collective unconscious, so to speak, in the room alive, and people could feel it in their bodies, in their emotional heaviness, in the stress that was in the room, and we could really touch the collective denial that is needed to suppress that information. And then afterwards, we saw often what happens if the denial turns into kind of a release. And by watching that over and over again and studying that, I got to understand, wow, that lives in our nervous system 24/7. We just don't know because our focus of consciousness is somewhere else in our daily activities. We are not aware of that place. But I saw so many groups and thousands of people come to that place where we touch what is there all the time. Same as the childhood stress is there, and we notice it when we get triggered. Same, the collective unintegrated past lives in us, and it's just a matter of time until it expresses itself either through symptoms or through like kind of a search function that we really go and look for it. When we look for it, we will find it. That's how I developed all the collective trauma work, because we started to learn how to look for it and then to find that collectively shared function. And I believe in order to um, understand this, maybe one um, uh, principle there is a notion that individuation might be equalized with being a separate being a separate particle, whereas we could say an individual is a specific expression of the whole. And now we are seeing more and more how interdependent we are. I mean, I'm only talking because I'm breathing, and the air that I'm breathing is being produced by the plants around me and the ecosystem around me. And the fact that I have energy to speak is because I can eat and I can drink and I can, keep my body functions up. And so I am an expression of the ecosystem that I'm part of. I'm not a separate particle within. That notion comes from the trauma separation that is systemic, and that's why it became part of our thinking, because we don't call that separation traumatized. We call that separation as that's how the world is, that's how we are as human beings. But it's a systemic unconsciousness. And if we reveal that systemic unconsciousness, I think a lot of things are going to change because we see something that is so inherent to our nature. It's like swimming in the water as a fish and then talking about water because the water is so normal or the air is so normal that it's simply part of my life. It seems like that's how the world is. But if trauma becomes so normal, then we actually perpetuate the wound and we will actually unconsciously repeat it. And that cycle has to stop and can stop. We know how to do it. And I believe that's the exciting part about the systemic effect of trauma, collective trauma, that we are more and more finding out tools and ways and practices how to illuminate collective trauma and how to begin to integrate it as collectives.
Yeah, and here in the Harvard community, when people have attended your workshops, there have been some really positive feedback in a new area that people have never explored before. And I think everyone is finding their orientation in how to discuss collective trauma, not just from an academic perspective, but what it actually personally means for me in my life. And one of the symptoms, as you said, and it seems pretty prevalent among many people, is this numbness, this sense of disassociation. There are too many things going on. I'm too flooded. I have my own intergenerational history, say with slavery or another form of injustice, and top of that is COVID. So, what would you say about that chronic level of disassociation and numbness that many people who are in the academic world or in other jobs that have basically a mental focus only? What would you say about that?
Mm. Yeah, I would say first that I believe first it starts with cherishing or honoring or respecting the function of dissociation and a much deeper appreciation for the capacity of my nervous system and my psyche. I don't like to talk about psyche as a separate thing. It's part of my whole body. So that the function of my whole embodied system to dissociate from too intense or overwhelming experiences. And dissociation is for a 2 month old baby, overwhelming is something completely different than for a grown up 30-year-old guy or woman. I think it's very important that we don't measure overwhelm just by what's overwhelming to us. Overwhelm has many, many, many different flavors. And so to honor and actually become aware of dissociation and numbness, that I become aware actually what I am feeling right now is that I'm not feeling. That's not common knowledge. Because often when we don't feel, we try to bridge that gap with our minds. instead of pausing a moment and say, when I don't feel, it means that a part of me, most probably not just my grown up perspective of today, but a part of me is overwhelmed. And when there's too much data for a computer, so we need to kind of create portions and then process it step by step. And that's true for our biocomputer too. And so that means, practically speaking, in our time, we need to learn regulation mechanisms and practices and tools, how we can regulate ourselves within a world that seems to be overwhelming, and learn how to do that internally and learn how to do that externally, which means that I learn how much data, when I read the news, for example, I can really read and be connected to myself, and how much can I read only when I disconnect internally, when I numb myself, because it's overwhelming to read about many tragedies in the world and many things that are overwhelming. Often, when we read the news, how many people really process holistically the information that they read, that we read? I think that more often than not, we see things like wars or shootings or racist actions or social injustice, and it's so hard to stay with it and feel what it means, what's happening to that person, what's happening in our society. So it's better to be absent sometimes and to be cognitively informed, but only up to here. And the rest needs to be protected. And and I'm saying this more explicitly because I believe when the mind dissociates from the body, it becomes a weapon. When the mind is in service of the body, which is nature, then the mind and nature work deeply interrelated. And then I think it's a great blessing. And and we are part of that kind of spectrum in some way. And so when we see what's happening in our society, I need to find first a regulation of how much I can really digest, because overwhelming myself more doesn't help. Then also to be interested in how much of my own past is actually being activated when I read things on the news, or when I hear things in my workplace, or when I witness situations in life, that often our past, the past that we carry unconsciously, is being activated. And then I call it, oh, it's stressful. Like many people walk with the myth that stress happens at the workplace. I'm saying, no, stress happened most probably in your childhood. And that at the workplace, it's being triggered and reactivated. And then we call it difficult situations with authorities, difficult situations with co-workers, or with situations with kind of in teams, and dysregulated work situations. But we are creating them together. And I think when we um, put practices in place, how we digest our own undigested past, so we liberate part of ourselves. When we find ways how to, through mindfulness processes and through inner reflection processes, I can find a deeper regulation in myself. Even sometimes answering 2 or 3 seconds later is a tiny thing we can do, but just taking a breath and then answering might make a huge difference sometimes, especially when we are stressed. Learning how to keep our nervous system, like Steve Porges says, in the social engagement zone, and learn to regulate ourselves so that we can be active and relaxed as needed. These are all things I think we can learn through practice and learn through integration. And then I find another way how to relate to my environment. So my relational capacity is actually, as the 75-year Harvard study shows, that it's the number one factor of well-being. And we can do something to upgrade our relational capacities. We can do something to improve our relational network. And I'm not talking about the Facebook friends, I'm talking about the people that we are in contact with every day, personally and virtually. We can take care that that network is as healthy as possible, at least from our side. So there are things we can do, and then in the society that I'm more mindful of my reactivity and responsiveness, and I use all of this as an awareness process to develop more resilience, and that's what we need in our time: personal and community resilience, especially um, when facing more and more pressure.
So you have a new book called Healing Collective Trauma. And in that, you talk a bit about a process that you do, the process you've been describing in groups. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more about that, because I think people who are listening are probably very interested in what you've done in those settings where you've brought together different groups, especially Germans and Israelis, but others as well. And through your nonprofit, the Pocket Project, where the focus is working through and integrating collective trauma. So it'd be great to hear more about that process and what we can understand and learn about it from where we sit. So if, whether we attend one in the future or are just curious about how it actually works.
Yeah, it works on the principle that individual or systemic, individual also is a system. My whole body is also like a system collaboration. So systemic coherence is the power or the resource to integrate this, the fragmentation of the same system. And sometimes the system doesn't have enough inner coherence. So then we need to build it through group processes, and we need to supplement it. Like a trauma therapist might be for a client the missing supplement and the missing kind of infusion of um, coherence in order to be able to integrate the traumatization enough, build more inner stability and structure, to be more to develop more inner fluidity and flow in order to be able to respond to the world in a new way and have a different inner and outer regulation. So that would be the thing for the personal side. And but similar principles I'd work when we work with larger groups. So we had many groups where we, as you said, we worked for some time on the Second World War and the Holocaust legacy in Germany, Israel, and with people from all over the world. And then we expanded it and looked at topics like colonialism, gender traumatization, racism in the US, and like so we and other topics. And now we see that when a group comes together and when we create a safe and coherent field, coherent doesn't mean harmony. Coherence means a certain relational framework where, because through relation, our nervous systems have the capacity to create synchronized fields. My nervous system, and I feel you, I feel you feeling me, is the basic wiring for attachment of a human being. I feel you feeling me. And when we apply that as one principle, for example, and then how I'm aware of a group, of a team, of the large scale group process. So I'm aware of myself, I'm aware of you as an individual, and I'm aware of the we. And when we intensify that awareness, it creates some kind of group synchronization. And then, from a certain level of safety and synchronization, our nervous systems actually feel safe enough to release past, like stored unconscious past. And because the system wants to heal, but the system, my nervous system or our nervous systems are intelligent enough not to release that stuff if it's not possible. If the system around us cannot hold it, then it's a re-traumatization. And so we store that somewhere in hidden rooms. But in the moment we feel that the relational coherence is strong enough, the self-healing mechanism is being activated, and that information wants to come to the surface. So we learned how to steer and modulate that process so that it's not too overwhelming, but it's surfacing enough of the collective unconscious material that we can digest a portion together as that group. This might be 100 people, 500 people, 1,000 people, depends. With the right therapist network, we did processes with 1,000 people, and then we had 40 psychotherapists or trauma therapists in the room to deal with the individual processes. And um, and so there's a cohering phase or coherence phase. And then there is the phase, as I said before, we will meet the collective denial. There's a suppression in many people to keep that information down. When that melts, there is a kind of an emergence of that information in the group consciousness. So in many people go through an internal process. And then we can look at special aspects of that specific collective cultural traumatization, like the Nazi Jewish dynamic and the trauma that has been inflicted and deep violation of core principles of life. And so when and then when that process is matured enough, then we often work in smaller breakout groups, and usually that's a process of a few days. And And then when it comes to a completion, we integrate it and we go into a meta learning reflection. So we look at what was actually the learning individually and collectively. And yeah, and like this, every group has a certain capacity to digest part of the process. We call this CTIP, collective trauma integration process. And I have seen also some people that went through the same process multiple times. And it's very interesting to see the level of triggeredness the first time and second time and third time. So there's a capacity growing. So there's less individual participation in the collective traumatization and a higher capacity to stay present within such a process. And that's really interesting. So we are looking how to apply that. At the moment, we have in our nonprofit, the Pocket Project, 23 labs, like international labs that deal with all kinds of traumatizations around the world. And so, and around this, we have a meta learning process or platform to harvest the information that these labs produce. And so that's very exciting, so that we can learn something about the collective trauma network or web in around the world and learn from each other's findings and upgrade our knowledge and capacity and skill set, how to work on its transformation.
That's fascinating right there. I wonder if you can just say a bit more. I know from what I understand, labs are actually these groups right now in very focusing on very specific topics or in very specific regions, and they've come together. I think it's like 800 people in about 20 something different groups, which are called these international labs, and they are working on the local symptoms and manifestations in that topic or sort of region. And what is the vision of both how they work separately in their regions and topics and how they would come together?
Yeah. Um, the so the labs are, as you said, groups of various sizes. They all have a facilitator team, and people signed up because they were interested in the topic. It can be gender traumatization, can be the Holocaust, can be colonialism, the Rwandan genocide, Latin America, like colonialism. There's one like the racism and slavery in the US and the Native American genocide. And also, I think there are many more that I'm not mentioning now. And um, so we come together, this group goes through like a clarification of the local traumatization at first, through research, and then we go into through different phases of the exploration of collective trauma. So what we learned so far, what composes collective trauma, like my collective trauma conditioning. Every one of us grew up in a society that carried some sort of traumatization, and how did that impact me in my development? And then the ancestral stream, how did my grandparents go through the Second World War? How did that affect my parents? How does this affect me, my relations, and so on? And then we go deeper into the collective trauma process. And then we slowly emerge again through various questions. And finally, after 6 months, 7 months, we reflect in a meta learning process what happened for us. And the whole process is supervised. We have a supervision team, including my supervision, and that so that the facilitators come together regularly. We share, we look at the difficulties that show up, we look at what they mean, what do we learn, and and so the whole system goes through a learning process. Also, we all go through a learning process, and there will be regular publications about the learnings and findings. And so, like this, we offer to the um, public basically like a possibility to participate in our insights and our reflections and learnings. And so there's the group, there's the bigger group of all the groups together, and then there's the dialogue between us as a nonprofit organization and the society. And like this, we learn basically on various levels or dimensions at the same time. And since social transformation, it's there is still a limitation how much we can see impacts of such a work because it's such a big system. So there's a research complexity, I would say, how to find out what are all the parameters that are changing because various groups are doing collective trauma work. So it's since that's a very young field, there's so much still to be discovered and to be revealed. And I think it's exciting. We had such a huge resonance. Same as we did a big summit with almost more than 50 speakers and artists, and we had more than 100,000 people participate. So there is a strong resonance at the moment, and we see also when we look into our societies what's happening in the world. So I think that's very important, and also how technology on the one hand helps us to do this work, but on the other hand uses the collective trauma absence unconsciously to um, amplify basically symptoms. And so there's much we can learn, I believe, which is also for many of the social media platforms. I think it's an incredible knowledge because then we will understand what are all the issues that we face on social media. And many of them are collective trauma symptoms. I guess there's so much that in the next decades we're going to find out. So it's an exciting exploration.
Yes, I have one more question, and that relates to this topic of collective trauma. As you said, it's becoming much more shared. It's a term you can Google more. It's in Twitter, and people are actually talking about it in the last years, and even especially in 2020 for many reasons. And I wonder if you can speak to a bit about what kind of enthusiasm and sort of perspective one needs to really engage in such a challenging at times topic or such a heavy topic. And the way you share it is very enthusiastic, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of heaviness in your approach. And I wonder what you can share about that.
Yeah, because I believe there's that we are dealing with the pain of the world, so to speak. So there is a good reason for calling it heavy at first, but then often we are standing, and if that's in health, public health, mental health, uh, economic issues, very much on the ecological side, social issues, criminal justice issues. There's so many issues that are symptoms of an underlying root cause. And I'm so enthusiastic because I believe the more we will understand what all of us have been born into or in, like we came into this world that was already traumatized before we were here. And that's why it's so hard to see the entirety and the systemic effect. Because when we grow up in this world, it seems normal to us. Well, these things, this we can say that that's how life is. But once we identify, no, these are structures of life, of evolution that developed over millions of years, and they are functional structures, and then there are frozen structures that are not moving and not moving with the flow of life, and they create symptoms. And so I'm very passionate because I believe we more and more discover something fundamental, a root cause of suffering. And the more we will learn about it, we will actually develop tools to relieve incredible amounts of suffering. So at first it looks like it's heavy, and it is because we are dealing with the major ethical catastrophes on this planet, basically. Because underneath trauma, there's always healing trauma always means an ethical restoration and an ethical upgrade. So post-traumatic growth in its deepest place is an ethical realignment. That's what helps the tissue of life to heal. Like when the skin heals, the tissue of life heals with the ethical restoration. And there were uncountable genocides and wars and all kinds of transgressions. When we come to the place of restoration, kind of there's a kind of an illumination, the self-healing mechanism of life heals the tissue of life. And it doesn't matter where on the planet that happens, and it has different specific expressions, but there's kind of a universal nature to all of that. And I believe on the way to face global challenges, we need global collaboration. In order to face climate change, there's a pressure, kind of a growth pressure, to develop new capacities and new global collaborations. And with the friction and the tension that those unconscious collective trauma fields create, it's simply much harder because we feel more separate. There are many more other motivations, unconscious motivations, that in a way look like they prevent that from happening. And then we have great mental ideas, but we all know that even if I read many books about something, especially when it's about human development, I might still go through the same conflicts in my life, in my family, in my environment and workplaces. We still deal with the same basic dynamics. And so to be able to embody my knowledge, that's different. That I'm really able to walk my talk, to live an authentic life, and to be able to put my understanding into an embodied practice and way to create my life. And that's why I'm so hopeful. And I believe that many people feel that call at the moment. Many people I speak to are immediately very resonant and kind of even intuitively have a resonance. So there is a strong resonance, and we brought together many leaders in various fields, also scientific fields, um, that immediately felt resonant through our summits and participated immediately. So there is something that's in the air of our time. And I believe that's the next evolutionary step, that collective healing will support individual healing and will actually help us to learn more about individual health. And these two systems will um, appear again as the unity that they are, that the collective and the individual not separate, they're interdependent, interdependent system.
Thank you, Thomas. And of course, we've had those conversations with you at Harvard. We've had faculty, clinicians, sociologists, psychiatrists, many different faculty members and staff attend your workshop. So they will look forward to continuing that with you in
Mm.
January for your next workshop. And we really appreciate you taking the time to do this Q&A today with Harvard Gazette.
Thank you so much, Laurie, for your incredible work. Thank you.